There's a question we've been sitting with for a while now, and we think you might have asked it yourself at some point. What do you do when the only person who believed in you is gone, and everything they left behind is about to be taken too? This is the story of Rowena Hatch, and if you stay with us until the end, we think you'll understand exactly why we couldn't stop thinking about it. She was 22 years old when her teacher died, and 22 years and 3 days old when she was told to leave the premises. That was how the landlord put it, the premises. Like she was a piece of furniture left behind after a sale. Like the 7 years she'd spent learning her trade in that small, cedar-scented workshop on the edge of Harwick, Kentucky, meant nothing more than an inconvenience to be cleared out by Thursday. Her teacher, a man named Absalom Rigg, had been a tinsmith. Not the kind who fixed gutters and charged by the hour. The kind who made things, coffee pots with seams so tight they never leaked, lanterns with patterns pressed into them like lace, oil cans you'd mistake for jewelry if you didn't know better. He had learned his trade from his own father, who had learned it from his, and when his hands finally gave out and his eyesight started going soft at the edges, he had passed what he knew to Rowena. She was 15 when she first came to him. An orphan, technically. Her mother had died of fever when Rowena was 9, and her father had remarried within the year. His new wife, a woman named Dorothea Greel, had made it plain from the beginning that she had no use for a stepdaughter. By the time Rowena was 15, the house had become a place where she cooked and cleaned and was invisible until she wasn't. And when Absalom Rigg posted a notice at the feed store looking for an apprentice willing to work for room and board, Rowena had taken it down herself and walked to his door. He had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Can you sit still for 4 hours without complaining?" She had said yes. "Good," he said. "That's half the job." 7 years later he was gone. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Fast and quiet, the way the old ones sometimes go. And Rowena was standing on the porch of the workshop, with everything she owned packed into a canvas bag, holding a tinsmith's crimping iron wrapped in cloth. The last tool Absalom had placed in her hands, a week before he died, without explanation. She didn't know then what the tool would lead her to. She didn't know about the old building in Calder's Hollow, or the sealed room in the back, or what had been waiting inside it for 63 years. None of us would have known. That's the thing about this kind of story. The treasure doesn't announce itself. Harwick was not a town that made it easy to start over. It was the kind of place where everyone had known everyone else for 2 generations, where your family name opened doors or closed them, and where a young woman with no family, no property, and a trade that most people associated with old men and barns had very few options. Rowena had spent her first week after leaving the workshop sleeping in the back room of a dry goods store, whose owner, a heavy-set man named Fenton Bird, had agreed to let her stay in exchange for repairing his store's tin ceiling tiles. A job that had taken her 2 days and left her palms cut in 4 places. She didn't complain. That was the other half of the job, she figured. Fenton turned out to be more decent than she'd expected. He was 60, widowed, and had the temperament of a man who had long ago run out of energy for cruelty. He told her about a woman up on Crescent Road who had a room to rent. Cheap, he said, which meant barely habitable, and he told her something else almost as an afterthought. "You know they're finally tearing down the old Wyville building," he said, not looking up from his ledger. "Out in Calder's Hollow. Been abandoned since before the war. County's been trying to figure out what to do with it for years." Rowena hadn't known about the Wyville building, and she didn't particularly care. She was thinking about the room Crescent Road and whether she had enough money left for a week's rent. But Fenton kept talking. "Old man Wyville ran a dry goods operation out there. Bigger than mine, they say. Sold everything from rope to remedies. Closed up sudden back in 1891. No one ever said why. The family moved east, and the building just sat." He paused. "They say he was into something else, too. Something he didn't advertise." "Like what?" Rowena asked, mostly to be polite. Fenton shrugged. "Like money," he said. "Like the kind you don't put in a bank." She forgot about it by the time she reached the room on Crescent Road, or she thought she had. The room was exactly as cheap as Fenton had implied. 1 window, 1 cot, a wood stove that listed to the left, and a smell like old newspaper and creek mud. But it was hers, and it locked from the inside, and after weeks of sleeping in other people's spaces, that lock felt like a small luxury she found work slowly. A busted copper flue at the schoolhouse. A set of milk pails at a farm 2 miles out. A family on the north side of town who needed their kitchen stovepipe replaced and were willing to pay in cash, plus a jar of apple butter, which Rowena accepted without comment. She was careful with every dollar. She kept Absalom's crimping iron on the windowsill where she could see it, because looking at it steadied something inside her that she didn't have a name for. She thought about him most in the evenings, when the light came in sideways and turned everything amber. He had not been a warm man in the conventional sense. He didn't hug, didn't say I'm proud of you, didn't give speeches. But he showed her things. Showed her how the metal had memory, how you had to understand what it wanted to do before you could convince it to do something else. He showed her that patience wasn't a virtue, exactly. It was a skill, and you got better at it the same way you got better at anything. By practicing when you don't feel like it, he'd say. She practiced, and she kept hearing about the Wyville building. Not from Fenton. From everyone. From the woman who rented her the room, who mentioned it when she found out Rowena was a tinsmith. From the man at the hardware store who wondered aloud whether there was anything salvageable in the old shop's equipment. From two boys she overheard at the church steps on a Sunday, daring each other to go inside, before the county crews came to knock it down. They say there's a back room that's been nailed shut since 1891, one of the boys said, in the voice people use when they're trying to frighten themselves. Nobody knows what's in it. Probably nothing, said the other. Probably, said the first. Or probably not. We want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part of the story where you have to understand something about who Rowena Hatch was. She was not the kind of person who chased legends. She was not impulsive. She had been trained by a man who measured twice and cut once, who treated recklessness the same way he treated rust, as something to be ground down before it spread. She had spent 7 years learning to be deliberate, but she was also 22, and broke, and tired of feeling like she was barely visible in this town, and something about that sealed back room wouldn't let go of her. She asked around. Not obviously, just the way you ask when you don't want people to think you're asking. She learned that the Wyville family's last surviving member, a man named Prosper Wyville, had died in 1948 in Lexington, leaving no heirs. The property had reverted to the county. The county had done nothing with it for almost 20 years. Because the building was on a parcel with a disputed boundary line, and no one had wanted to deal with the paperwork until now. She also learned that the sealed room in the back had been there since Marcus Wyville, the founder, had locked it himself in the fall of 1891, 3 weeks before his store closed. His clerk at the time, a very old man named Doll Renfrew, who was still alive and living outside of town at 89, had been one of the last people to see him before he closed the back door. Doll Renfrew was who she needed to talk to. She found him on a Thursday. His granddaughter let Rowena in with the kind of look people give strangers who show up unannounced. Not hostile, just watchful. Doll Renfrew himself was sitting near the window in a wooden chair with a blanket over his legs, and he was smaller than she'd expected, and sharper-eyed than she'd expected. And when she told him what she wanted to know, he looked at her for a long time without speaking. "What's your name?" he asked finally. She told him. "Who taught you your trade?" "Absalom Rigg," she said. "He died in March." Something shifted in the old man's face. "I knew Absalom," he said. "Not well. But I knew him." He folded his hands in his lap. "Sit down." She sat. He told her this in the fall of 1891. Marcus Wyville had been approached by a group of men. She gathered from Doll's careful phrasing that these men were not the kind who invited questions, and had agreed, out of fear or desperation or both, to hold something for them. He didn't know what it was. He had loaded it into the back room himself, in 3 iron lockboxes that 2 men had carried in after dark, and Marcus had sealed the room and tried to act like it hadn't happened. 3 weeks later, one of those men turned up dead in the next county over. Then another. Whatever business they'd been running had ended badly, and Marcus Wyville had packed his family and left Harwick inside of a week, and never came back. He told my father once, years later in a letter, that he'd half expected men to come looking for what was in that room, Doll said. But no one ever did. I think whoever knew about it was dead, or gone, or had decided it wasn't worth the trouble. "What was in the boxes?" Rowena asked. The old man looked at her steadily. He never said. He didn't want to know, I think. Some things are safer that way. After a moment, he added, "But Marcus Wyville was a cautious man. He wouldn't have sealed that room with an ordinary lock." He paused. He was also, for a time, an amateur tinsmith. She sat in her car on the way back into town, borrowed from Fenton's cousin, who owed Fenton something, and she held the crimping iron on her lap and thought about that. A tinsmith's lock, a sealed room, a building about to be torn down. She thought about what Absalom had told her once, about old craftsmen who sealed things so that only someone with the right training would know how to open them. It wasn't a story he'd made up. He'd shown her examples, in books on the history of the trade, examples of interlocking tin panels that functioned as locks without being locks. that would shear if you tried to pry them and hold if you tried to cut them, but would open, cleanly, perfectly, if you knew which point to press and in which order. She was 22, broke, and trained by the best tinsmith she'd ever known. And that room was about to be torn down in 6 weeks. She went on a Saturday morning, before the light got too high. She had asked Fenton whether he thought anyone would mind, and he had said in the tone of a man who has already decided not to be involved, "I don't think anyone's thought about that building in 20 years, Rowena." She took that as close enough to a yes. The building was further into Calder's Hollow than she'd expected, set back from the road on a lot thick with sumac and old blackberry canes gone woody and gray. The front door was long gone, just an opening hung with a piece of sheet metal someone had nailed there years ago. Inside it smelled like time. Old wood, old plaster, old air. The floors were soft in places. She stepped carefully, the way Absalom had taught her, heel to toe, feel the give before you trust the weight. The back of the building was walled off by a partition of old pine boards, and in the center of that partition was a door. Or what had been a door. It was sealed on all 4 sides with strips of tin, layered and overlapping, the seams crimped and rolled in a pattern she recognized. Not because she'd seen it before, but because she knew the hand behind it. She'd seen that same rolling crimp on a coffee pot lid, once in Absalom's workshop. He'd pointed it out to her. "That's Wyval work," he'd said. "Old family pattern. Good and stubborn." She understood then why he had given her the crimping iron. She didn't know if he'd known about this room. She didn't know if it was coincidence or something more deliberate. But she pressed the iron to the upper left corner of the panel, the way she would have done to open a Wyval-style seam, and the tin gave a small, precise movement, like something exhaling, and she worked her way down and across, and the door opened. Inside were 3 iron lock boxes. The locks on the boxes themselves were standard, rusted through, and the third one she tried opened with a pull and a short protest of corroded metal. Inside that box, packed in oilcloth so old it had gone brown and brittle, were documents, land certificates, most of them, signed, dated, notarized. 4 of them for parcels in Calder County, and 2 for property further east. And underneath those documents, wrapped separately and more carefully, was a smaller cloth bundle. She opened it. She counted. She sat down on the dusty floor of the Wyval building and held $200 in old bills in her lap. And she did not move for a very long time. Here is the part of this story that didn't make it into any newspaper, and we want you to know it, because we think it matters more than the money. On her way out of the building that morning, carrying the lockbox and picking her way back through the sumac, she heard something, a sound from further in the hollow, a sound that wasn't wind. She almost kept walking. She was 22, and she had just found more money than she'd seen in her life, and every instinct she had was saying go, now, before anyone sees you. But she stopped, and she went toward the sound. It was an old man. It turned out to be Doll Renfrew's neighbor, a man named Calvin Sutter, who was 81 and had come out to pick wild greens and had gone down hard on a root and was lying in the hollow with a twisted ankle, and she realized when she got closer was getting cold. Had been there, he thought, since early morning. She didn't have a car. She left the lockbox under a fallen log, covered it with leaves, and half-carried Calvin Sutter a quarter-mile to the road, where she flagged down a truck. She went back for the box that afternoon. She told people what she'd found. She had to, legally, and the county got involved, and the land certificates were eventually processed. Most of them reverting to the county itself since the original claimants were long dead, and the chain of title was hopelessly tangled. The money was a different matter. After months of inquiry, and no living heirs, and a set of circumstances that most people involved found easier to leave alone than to argue about, Rowena Hatch was quietly told that the cash, abandoned property, unclaimed for 63 years, belonging to men who had died in 1891, was hers. But Calvin Sutter had a bad winter. His heating oil ran out in February, and his daughter was in Tennessee and couldn't get back in time. And Rowena showed up at his door with 2 months of fuel, paid for out of the first money she'd spent. She didn't think of it as generosity, exactly. She thought of it as what you do. By the following spring, Rowena Hatch had rented a proper space on the main street of Harwick. Not a back room, not a borrowed corner, but a real shop with a window and a sign she'd made herself from tin, the letters pressed and clean. It said, Hatch Tin Work, Est. 1961. Fenton Bird came to the opening and brought apple butter, which she accepted without comment. Doll Renfrew's granddaughter came too, and told her that Doll had smiled when he'd heard the whole story, and had said, good, good. That room had been waiting for the right person to open it. And that old building in Calder's Hollow, It was torn down that June, same as scheduled. The county sent a crew out with a dozer, and it was done in a day. Nobody mourned it particularly. It had already given up what it was holding. In the corner of her new shop, on a shelf at eye level, Rowena kept one thing from Absalom Riggs' workshop: the crimping iron. She didn't use it for work. She had newer tools, better in most respects. But she kept it there where she could see it, because some things aren't tools anymore after a while. Some things are just proof that someone believed in you before you believed in yourself. We've been telling stories here for a while now, and here's the question we always find ourselves asking when we reach an ending like this one. Was it luck? Was it skill? Was it the specific kind of stubbornness that comes from having nothing left to lose? We think it was all three, but mostly we think it was this. Rowena Hatch went into that hollow on a Saturday morning, not because she was certain she'd find something, but because she couldn't stand the thought of never knowing. And she came back out not just with what she'd gone looking for, but with a little more of herself than she'd gone in with. So here's the question we'll leave with you today. If you had known what was waiting in that sealed room, if someone had told you exactly what was inside and exactly what it would take to get to it, would you have gone? We'd like to think most of us would say yes, but we think the braver answer is the one Rowena gave without anyone asking her. She went without knowing. She went because the door was there, and she knew how to open it, and sometimes that's enough of a reason. If this story stayed with you, we hope you'll leave us a comment and let us know what part hit you hardest. And if you're new here, welcome to Fireside Stories. There are more where this came from.